The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Rosewood Palace as Princess Catherine walked through the grand corridor, her silk slippers making soft whispers against the polished stone. The palace felt unusually quiet today, with only the distant sounds of servants preparing for the day's activities echoing through the vast halls. Catherine had grown accustomed to this peaceful routine over the past 3 months since Prince Alexander had departed for his diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria. Catherine paused at the large window overlooking the palace gardens, where autumn leaves danced in the gentle breeze. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose bushes that had been her wedding gift from Alexander 5 years ago. The roses were beginning their final bloom of the season, their deep crimson petals reminding her of the velvet cloak Alexander always wore during formal ceremonies. The princess had been managing the kingdom's charitable foundations in Alexander's absence, a responsibility that both challenged and fulfilled her. Yesterday, she had visited the children's hospital in the capital city, reading stories to young patients and bringing them handmade toys from the palace workshops. The children's laughter had filled a space in her heart that had felt empty since Alexander's departure, though nothing could truly replace the warmth of her husband's presence. Lady Margaret, Catherine's longtime friend and lady-in-waiting, approached with a gentle smile. "Your Highness, the morning correspondence has arrived," she said, extending a silver tray containing several official-looking envelopes and personal letters. Catherine recognized the royal seal of Valdoria among them, and her heart quickened with anticipation. "Any word from Prince Alexander?" Catherine asked, though she tried to keep her voice casual. Lady Margaret had become skilled at reading the princess's moods over the years, and Catherine didn't want to appear too eager, even though she checked for letters from her husband every single day. "I believe there may be something, Your Highness," Margaret replied with a knowing smile. She had served in the palace since before Catherine and Alexander's courtship began, and she understood the deep bond between the royal couple better than anyone. Catherine selected the letter bearing Alexander's personal seal, a phoenix rising from flames, symbolizing renewal and strength. As she broke the wax seal, she noticed the letter was unusually brief. Alexander typically wrote lengthy missives describing his diplomatic meetings, the people he encountered, and the beautiful landscapes of Valdoria. This letter contained only a few lines written in his familiar handwriting. "My dearest Catherine," the letter read, "the negotiations are proceeding well, though they require more delicate handling than initially anticipated. I miss you more than words can express. The autumn here reminds me of our walks through the palace gardens. I carry your photograph everywhere, and find myself looking at it whenever discussions become particularly challenging. All my love, Alexander." Catherine folded the letter carefully, feeling a mixture of joy and concern. While she was always happy to hear from Alexander, something about the brevity of this message felt different. Usually, his letters were filled with humor, detailed observations about court life in Valdoria, and affectionate memories of their time together. This letter, though loving, seemed almost hurried. The princess spent the rest of the morning in her private study, reviewing reports from the kingdom's education committee. She had been working to establish new schools in the rural villages, a project that Alexander had enthusiastically supported before his departure. The plans were progressing well, with construction beginning on 3 new buildings that would serve children who had previously traveled hours to reach the nearest school. As Catherine reviewed the architectural drawings, her mind wandered to Alexander. She imagined him in the grand halls of Valdoria's castle, his tall frame commanding attention in any room he entered. Alexander had a natural ability to put people at ease while maintaining the dignity befitting his royal status. It was one of the qualities that had first attracted Catherine to him during their arranged courtship, which had unexpectedly blossomed into genuine love. Their marriage had been a union between 2 kingdoms, designed to strengthen political and economic ties. However, Catherine and Alexander had discovered they shared similar values, a love of literature, and a commitment to using their privileged positions to help their people. What began as duty had transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and deep affection. Lunch was served in the smaller dining room that Catherine preferred when eating alone. The formal dining hall felt too large and echoing without Alexander's presence. As she ate her meal of roasted chicken with herbs from the palace garden, Catherine found herself remembering their last dinner together before his departure. Alexander had been unusually quiet that evening, seeming preoccupied with concerns about the diplomatic mission. The situation in Valdoria is more complex than father initially believed, Alexander had told her as they walked together through the moonlit gardens after dinner. There are factions within their court who oppose any alliance with our kingdom. I may need to stay longer than planned to build trust and find common ground. Catherine had understood the importance of the mission. The Kingdom of Valdoria controlled crucial trade routes that could bring prosperity to both kingdoms if proper agreements could be reached. However, she had also sensed Alexander's reluctance to leave, especially as they had been hoping to start a family together. The afternoon brought a visit from the kingdom's treasurer, Lord Benedict, who needed Catherine's approval for several expenditures related to the new school construction project. Catherine enjoyed these responsibilities and had discovered she had a talent for understanding complex financial matters. Alexander had often remarked that she should have been born to a family of merchants, given her shrewd ability to negotiate favorable terms for kingdom projects. "Your Highness," Lord Benedict said as he spread the financial documents across Catherine's desk, "I must say the costs are coming in lower than originally estimated. Your suggestion to source building materials locally rather than importing them has resulted in significant savings." Catherine smiled with satisfaction. "Not only does it save money, but it also supports our local craftsmen and reduces the time needed for construction. Prince Alexander will be pleased to hear about this progress when he returns." "Indeed, Your Highness. When might we expect His Royal Highness to return? The people ask about him frequently during my visits to the villages." "I expect he will return within the next month," Catherine replied, though privately she wondered if Alexander's mission might extend even longer than currently planned. The diplomatic situation seemed to be evolving in ways that required careful handling. As evening approached, Catherine made her way to the palace's music room, where a beautiful piano sat beneath a painted ceiling depicting scenes of seasonal celebrations. Music had always been her refuge during times of solitude or stress. She had learned to play as a child, and Alexander loved to listen to her practice, often sitting in a comfortable chair by the window while she played. Catherine chose to play a piece that Alexander particularly enjoyed, a gentle melody that seemed to capture the essence of falling leaves and crisp autumn air. As her fingers moved across the keys, she allowed herself to fully feel the loneliness that she usually kept carefully controlled during her public duties. The music provided a safe space for her emotions, and she found tears forming in her eyes as she played. The piece reminded her of their courtship period, when Alexander would request this particular song during formal events. Even before they had admitted their growing feelings for each other, there had been a special communication between them during these musical moments. Alexander's eyes would meet hers across the room, and she would play with extra care, knowing he was listening. After finishing the piece, Catherine remained at the piano bench, looking out at the gardens now shrouded in twilight. The palace groundskeepers had lit the pathway lanterns, creating a warm glow among the trees. This was the time of day she missed Alexander most acutely, the quiet evening hours when they would usually walk together or sit by the fire, sharing the events of their day. Lady Margaret appeared in the doorway with a gentle knock. "Your Highness, dinner will be ready shortly. Cook has prepared your favorite lamb stew with root vegetables." "Thank you, Margaret. I'll be along in a moment." Catherine closed the piano and stood, smoothing her afternoon dress. She had chosen to wear the deep blue gown that Alexander had complimented when she wore it to their anniversary celebration last year. Wearing it made her feel closer to him somehow. Dinner was a quiet affair, with Catherine dining alone while reviewing the next day's schedule. She had appointments with the head of the children's charity, a meeting with the palace architect about renovations to the guest quarters, and a formal tea with the wives of visiting dignitaries from a neighboring province. These responsibilities kept her busy and provided a sense of purpose, but they couldn't entirely fill the Alexander-shaped space in her daily routine. Before retiring for the evening, Catherine made her final stop at Alexander's study, a room she visited each night before bed. The room still carried his scent, a combination of the sandalwood soap he preferred and the leather of his favorite reading chair. His desk remained exactly as he had left it, with a half-finished letter to his younger brother and several books on diplomatic history marked with his personal bookmarks. Catherine sat in Alexander's chair and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, where she kept his letters organized by date. She reread several of his earlier messages from Valdoria, searching for clues about his current state of mind and the progress of his mission. The early letters had been optimistic and detailed, but she noticed they had gradually become shorter and more formal over the past few weeks. One letter from 2 weeks ago mentioned unexpected complications in the negotiations and certain members of the Valdorian court who remain resistant to our proposals. Catherine wondered if Alexander was facing more serious diplomatic challenges than he was revealing in his correspondence. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was protecting her from his concerns. As she prepared for bed in their shared chambers, Catherine found herself looking at the empty space beside her in their large four-poster bed. She had grown accustomed to sleeping alone, but she still instinctively reached across the bed each morning upon waking, expecting to find Alexander's familiar warmth. Their bed felt enormous without his presence, and even with extra blankets, she couldn't seem to get quite warm enough during the cool autumn nights. Catherine's final ritual each evening was to look at the miniature portrait of Alexander that she kept on her nightstand. The painting captured his kind eyes and gentle smile perfectly, showing him as she loved to see him, relaxed and happy, the weight of royal responsibilities temporarily set aside. She whispered good night to the portrait each evening, a small comfort that helped her feel connected to him despite the distance between them. As she finally settled into bed, Catherine found herself wondering what Alexander was doing at that very moment in Valdoria. Was he also lying awake, thinking of her? Was he looking at the matching portrait he carried with him? The time difference between the kingdoms meant he might still be in evening meetings or perhaps writing letters by candlelight in his guest chambers. The princess fell asleep that night with no idea that in just a few hours, her carefully ordered world would be transformed by Alexander's unexpected return and the surprising reasons behind his earlier-than-planned homecoming. The next day would bring revelations that would test their love and change the course of both their lives and their kingdom's future. Hashtag Prince Alexander's surprise return. Part 2, The First Light of Dawn, was just beginning to filter through the heavy curtains of Catherine's bedchamber when an urgent knocking at her door jolted her from sleep. Still groggy and disoriented, she heard Lady Margaret's voice calling softly but insistently from the corridor. "Your Highness, please forgive the early hour, but there is urgent news that requires your immediate attention." Catherine wrapped her silk robe around herself and opened the door to find Margaret's face flushed with excitement and something else, perhaps concern or confusion. Behind Margaret stood Captain James Hartford, the head of the palace guard, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of unusual agitation. "What is it?" Catherine asked, immediately alert. Her first thought was of Alexander. Had something happened to him in Valdoria? Had there been an accident during his journey? Or worse, some kind of diplomatic incident that had put him in danger? "Your Highness," Captain Hartford began, his voice carefully controlled. A rider arrived at the palace gates just before dawn with an urgent message. "Prince Alexander is returning to the kingdom, and his party should arrive within the next few hours." Catherine felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by confusion. "But that's wonderful news. Why do you both look so troubled? Has something happened? Is Alexander injured?" Margaret exchanged a glance with Captain Hartford before speaking. "Your Highness," the message was quite brief, and the circumstances seem unusual. Prince Alexander sent word that he is returning immediately and that he will explain everything upon his arrival. He also requested that his return be kept private, with no formal ceremony or announcement until he has spoken with you personally. This information struck Catherine as very strange indeed. Alexander was meticulous about royal protocol, and would never normally request to bypass the formal procedures that accompanied his return from official diplomatic missions. Something significant must have happened in Valdoria to cause such an unexpected change in plans. Did the messenger provide any other information about what happened in Valdoria, or why Prince Alexander is returning early? Catherine asked. Captain Hartford shook his head. The messenger was one of Prince Alexander's personal guards, Thomas Whitmore. He was exhausted from riding through the night, and said only that His Royal Highness had urgent business that required his immediate return to the palace. Whitmore collapsed from exhaustion shortly after delivering the message, and is now resting in the guard quarters. Catherine's mind raced with possibilities. Had the diplomatic negotiations failed completely? Had there been some kind of threat against Alexander that required him to flee Valdoria? Or perhaps there was urgent news about their own kingdom that required his attention. The secrecy surrounding his return was particularly puzzling and concerning. Very well, Catherine decided. Margaret, please ensure that Prince Alexander's chambers are prepared immediately. Have the kitchen staff prepare his favorite breakfast, but keep the number of people involved to a minimum. Captain Hartford, please station guards at the main entrance, but instruct them to be discreet. I want Alexander to feel welcome without drawing unnecessary attention to his arrival. As the servants hurried to carry out her instructions, Catherine found herself pacing her chambers, unable to return to sleep. She dressed carefully in one of Alexander's favorite gowns, an emerald green dress that brought out the color of her eyes and that he had often complimented. If something was seriously wrong, she wanted to look strong and composed for whatever news he might bring. The hours passed slowly as Catherine waited. She attempted to read, but found herself unable to concentrate on the words. She tried to work on her embroidery, a calming activity that usually helps settle her nerves, but her hands trembled slightly, making precise stitches impossible. Finally, she decided to wait in Alexander's study, surrounded by his books and personal belongings, where she felt closest to him. As she sat in Alexander's leather chair, Catherine found herself remembering their last conversation about the Valdoria mission. Alexander had been optimistic about the negotiations, believing that he could successfully establish trade agreements that would benefit both kingdoms. He had spent weeks preparing, studying Valdorian history and culture, learning key phrases in their language, and developing detailed proposals for economic cooperation. The sound of horses approaching in the courtyard below caused Catherine's heart to leap. She moved to the window and saw a small party of riders entering through the main gates. Even from a distance, she immediately recognized Alexander's distinctive posture and the way he sat his horse. He was alive and appeared to be uninjured, which brought enormous relief. However, as Catherine watched more carefully, she noticed that Alexander's traveling party was much smaller than what had originally accompanied him to Valdoria. Instead of the formal diplomatic entourage that had departed 3 months ago, only 4 guards accompanied him, and their horses showed signs of hard travel. This suggested that Alexander had left Valdoria quickly and with minimal ceremony. Catherine hurried from the study to the main entrance hall, arriving just as Alexander dismounted from his horse in the courtyard. Through the large windows, she could see him speaking quietly with his guards, his expression serious and focused. Then he looked up toward the palace windows, and their eyes met across the distance. Even from far away, Catherine could see relief and love in his gaze, mixed with something else, perhaps exhaustion or concern. Alexander moved quickly up the palace steps, his long stride covering the ground with purpose. Catherine positioned herself at the top of the grand staircase, wanting to greet him with dignity while also showing how much she had missed him. As the heavy doors opened and Alexander stepped into the entrance hall, Catherine felt her carefully composed demeanor begin to crack. He looked thinner than when he had left, and there were new lines of stress around his eyes. His traveling clothes were dusty from the long ride, and his usually perfectly groomed hair was disheveled. But his smile when he saw Catherine was radiant and genuine, transforming his tired features into the face she loved so dearly. "Catherine," Alexander said, his voice warm but tired, He opened his arms, and she ran down the stairs to embrace him, not caring about royal protocol or the servants who might be watching. Their embrace lasted long moments, with Catherine feeling the solid reality of her husband's presence after months of missing him. "I've missed you so much," Catherine whispered against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent, and feeling the tension she had carried for weeks finally begin to release. "And I have missed you more than I can express," Alexander replied, holding her tightly. "There were times during the past few days when I wondered if I would ever hold you like this again." Catherine pulled back slightly to look at his face, alarmed by his words. "Alexander, what happened in Valdoria? Your return is so unexpected, and you look exhausted. Are you hurt? Is there some kind of danger?" Alexander glanced around the entrance hall, noticing several servants and guards within hearing distance. "Let's speak privately first, my love. There is much I need to tell you, and some of it is quite serious." They made their way to Alexander's private study, the room where Catherine had spent so many evenings missing him. Once the door was closed and they were alone, Alexander seemed to relax slightly, though Catherine could see he was still carrying considerable stress. "Before I tell you what happened in Valdoria," Alexander began, taking Catherine's hands in his, "I need you to know that I am safe, you are safe, and our kingdom is secure. However, the situation is more complex than we initially understood." Catherine nodded, bracing herself for whatever news Alexander was about to share. She had learned during their years of marriage that Alexander always presented the most reassuring information first when he had difficult news to convey. The diplomatic negotiations with Valdoria were progressing well initially, Alexander continued. King Marcus seemed genuinely interested in establishing stronger ties between our kingdoms, and we had reached preliminary agreements on several important trade matters. However, about 2 weeks ago, I discovered that not everyone in the Valdorian court was supportive of these arrangements. Alexander moved to pour himself a glass of water from the pitcher on his desk, his hands showing slight tremors from exhaustion and stress. "There is a faction within Valdoria, led by Marcus's younger brother Prince Ricardo, who believe that any alliance with our kingdom would be detrimental to Valdorian interests. They have been working behind the scenes to undermine the negotiations and to convince King Marcus that I cannot be trusted." Catherine felt a chill of concern. Court intrigue and political manipulation were always dangers when dealing with international diplomacy, but it sounded like the situation in Valdoria had become particularly treacherous. "What kind of actions did this faction take?" Catherine asked, though she feared the answer. At first, it was subtle: delays in scheduling meetings, lost messages, small acts of disrespect that could be explained as accidents or misunderstandings. But then Prince Ricardo began spreading rumors that I was actually in Valdoria to gather intelligence about their military defenses and trade secrets. He suggested that our marriage was part of a long-term plan to eventually absorb Valdoria into our kingdom through political manipulation. Catherine felt anger rising within her at the suggestion that their genuine love and partnership could be characterized as part of some cynical political plot. Surely King Marcus didn't believe such nonsense. King Marcus is a good man, but he is also cautious and has learned to be suspicious after years of navigating court politics, Alexander explained. The rumors created enough doubt that he began to question my motives and the wisdom of the alliance. Prince Ricardo was clever. He never made direct accusations, but instead raised concerns and asked seemingly innocent questions that planted seeds of doubt. Alexander sat down heavily in his desk chair, the weight of the past weeks showing in his posture. The situation reached a crisis point 4 days ago when someone, almost certainly one of Ricardo's supporters, planted what appeared to be stolen documents in my chambers. The documents were forgeries designed to look like secret communications between me and our own military commanders, discussing strategies for eventual military intervention in Valdoria. Catherine gasped, understanding immediately how damaging such evidence would appear, even if it was completely fabricated. "How did you prove the documents were false?" Fortunately, I had been keeping detailed records of all my activities and communications during the mission, exactly for situations like this, Alexander replied. I was able to demonstrate that the documents contained information I could not have known and reference meetings that never took place. However, the damage to trust was significant, and I realized that remaining in Valdoria had become counterproductive. The full implications of the situation were beginning to dawn on Catherine. So you left to prevent the situation from deteriorating further and to protect the possibility of future diplomatic relationships? Exactly. I spoke privately with King Marcus and explained my position. He was apologetic about the circumstances, but agreed that my departure was probably wise given the current political climate in his court. We left the possibility open for future negotiations when the situation stabilizes. Catherine moved to stand behind Alexander's chair, placing her hands on his shoulders and feeling the tension in his muscles. You made the right decision, but it must have been incredibly frustrating to have your genuine efforts undermined by political manipulation. It was, Alexander admitted. But there's more to the story, and this part is what made my departure so urgent that I couldn't wait for normal diplomatic procedures. Catherine felt her heart rate increase again. What else happened? On my final night in Valdoria, one of the servants who had been assigned to my chambers, a young woman named Elena who had been helpful throughout my stay, came to me with a warning. She had overheard Prince Ricardo and his supporters planning something more serious than just political embarrassment. Alexander turned in his chair to face Catherine directly, his expression grave. Elena risked her own safety to tell me that Ricardo's faction was planning to arrange an accident during my return journey. They hoped to eliminate me while making it appear that I had been killed by bandits or had suffered a mishap while traveling. This would serve multiple purposes. It would remove me as an ongoing diplomatic presence, and my death could potentially be blamed on our kingdom's enemies, further destabilizing relationships between our kingdoms. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as she realized how much danger Alexander had been in. Did this servant provide any proof of these plans? Elena had limited information, but she was able to tell me the approximate location where the attack was planned and some details about the timing. More importantly, she warned me that members of Ricardo's faction had been asking detailed questions about my planned route home and the size of my escort. Alexander stood and began pacing, his energy returning as he recounted his escape from the dangerous situation. I immediately decided to leave Valdoria using an alternate route with minimal escort and traveling much faster than originally planned. Instead of the main roads where an ambush could be arranged, we took mountain paths that are difficult but safer. We rode almost continuously for 3 days, stopping only briefly for rest. That explains why you look so exhausted and why your escort was so small, Catherine observed. But what about the servant who warned you? Is she safe? I arranged for Elena to be rewarded for her loyalty and gave her enough gold to leave Valdoria immediately if she chose to do so. I also provided her with a letter of recommendation to our court if she ever needs sanctuary. She saved my life and possibly prevented a diplomatic crisis that could have led to conflict between our kingdoms. Catherine sank into the chair beside Alexander's desk, overwhelmed by the realization of how close she had come to losing her husband. When I woke up this morning, my biggest concern was wondering when you might return from your mission. I never imagined that you had been fleeing for your life. I didn't want to worry you with the details until I was safely home, Alexander said gently. But there's one more aspect of this situation that we need to discuss, because it affects our future plans. Catherine looked up at him, wondering what other complications this diplomatic mission might have created. What is it? My early departure from Valdoria and the circumstances surrounding it mean that we need to be very careful about how we handle diplomatic relationships going forward. Prince Ricardo's faction will likely claim that my sudden departure proves I was up to something suspicious. They may even spread rumors that I fled because I was caught in some kind of wrongdoing. Alexander moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens, the same window where Catherine had stood just hours earlier, missing him. We need to be prepared for the possibility that other kingdoms may be influenced by these rumors, at least until the truth becomes clear. This could affect trade relationships and diplomatic opportunities for months or even years. Catherine joined him at the window, taking his hand and feeling grateful beyond words that he was standing beside her, safe and unharmed. We'll face whatever challenges come together, just as we always have. The important thing is that you're home and safe. There's one more thing, Alexander said, his voice softening as he turned to face her. During those 3 days of hard travel, when I wasn't sure if we would escape safely, I made some decisions about our future that I want to discuss with you. Catherine saw something new in Alexander's expression, not worry or exhaustion, but a kind of resolution and clarity that hadn't been there when he first arrived. What kind of decisions? I realized that all the diplomatic success in the world doesn't matter if I lose what's most important to me. I want to spend less time on foreign missions and more time here with you, building the kind of life and family we've talked about. The experience in Valdoria showed me that there are risks I'm not willing to take anymore, not when it means leaving you alone and worried. Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than the worry and loneliness that had filled her day for the past 3 months. Are you certain? I know how important the diplomatic work is to you and to our kingdom. It is important, and I'll continue to serve our people in whatever way is needed, Alexander replied. But I can be effective in other ways, hosting visiting dignitaries here, working on domestic policies, and focusing on strengthening our kingdom from within. I don't need to travel to distant courts to make a difference. As Catherine embraced her husband again, she felt that the ordeal in Valdoria, frightening as it had been, might ultimately lead to positive changes in their life together. Alexander was home safely, and his experience had given him new perspectives on what truly mattered. The challenges ahead would be significant, but they would face them together, stronger for having weathered this separation and the dangers it had brought. Hashtag Prince Alexander's surprise return. Part 3. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the royal dining room as Catherine and Alexander shared their first meal together in 3 months. Cook had prepared all of Alexander's favorite dishes: roasted beef with rosemary, fresh bread from the palace ovens, and apple tart with cream from the royal dairy. Despite the wonderful food and Alexander's safe return, Catherine noticed that her husband seemed preoccupied, occasionally staring out the window or pausing mid-conversation as if listening for something. "Alexander," Catherine said gently, setting down her fork, "you're home now. You're safe. But I can see that you're still troubled. Is there something else you haven't told me about what happened in Valdoria?" Alexander looked at her with a rueful smile, the kind of expression that had always told Catherine he was debating how much to share about his concerns. After 12 years of friendship and 5 years of marriage, she could read his moods as easily as her favorite books. "You know me too well," Alexander admitted. "Yes, there is something else. While I was traveling home, I had time to think about the broader implications of what happened in Valdoria. Prince Ricardo's actions weren't just aimed at disrupting our specific diplomatic mission. They were part of a larger strategy." Catherine set down her teacup, giving Alexander her full attention. She had learned that when her husband began analyzing political situations in this careful way, the conclusions were usually significant. "During my final days in Valdoria, I was able to piece together information from various conversations and observations," Alexander continued. "Prince Ricardo has been corresponding with representatives from the Kingdom of Blackwood, our neighbors to the east. Blackwood has always been suspicious of our growing influence in the region, and they would benefit significantly if our diplomatic relationships with other kingdoms were undermined." The Kingdom of Blackwood had been a source of tension for years. King Hrothgar of Blackwood was ambitious and had been gradually expanding his territory through a combination of military pressure and strategic marriages. Any weakening of their own kingdom's alliances would make them more vulnerable to Blackwood's expansionist goals. "So you believe Prince Ricardo was working with Blackwood to sabotage our relationship with Valdoria?" Catherine asked. "I'm almost certain of it. Some of the forged documents that were planted in my chambers contained details about our kingdom's defenses that only someone with access to Blackwood intelligence would know. Prince Ricardo couldn't have created those documents without outside assistance. Alexander stood and moved to the sideboard, where he poured himself a small glass of wine, unusual for him during afternoon meals, which told Catherine that his stress levels remained high despite being home. If that's true, then what happened in Valdoria may just be the beginning, Catherine observed. Blackwood will likely attempt to interfere with our relationships with other neighboring kingdoms as well. Exactly, which is why I need to speak with Father immediately about adjusting our diplomatic and military strategies. We can't afford to be caught off guard if similar situations arise with other allies. King Edmund, Alexander's father, had been allowing his son to take increasing responsibility for diplomatic affairs as preparation for eventually inheriting the throne. However, threats from Blackwood would require the full authority and experience of the current king. There's something else, Alexander continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. The attempt on my life in Valdoria wasn't just about disrupting diplomatic relationships. Elena, the servant who warned me, overheard Prince Ricardo saying that eliminating me would create chaos in our kingdom's succession, since we don't yet have children to secure the royal line. Catherine felt a chill at the calculation behind such thinking. She and Alexander had been hoping to start a family, but they had also agreed not to rush, wanting to ensure their kingdom was stable and their own relationship was strong enough to provide a secure foundation for children. That makes our decision to focus more on domestic matters even more important, Catherine said thoughtfully. If Blackwood sees our lack of heirs as a vulnerability, then establishing the succession becomes a priority for the kingdom's security. Alexander returned to his seat and took Catherine's hand. I've been thinking about that during the journey home. We've talked about having children, but always in general terms, as something for the future. Given what we now know about the threats facing our kingdom, perhaps we should be more intentional about our plans. Catherine squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth and strength that had always comforted her. Are you suggesting we should have children for political reasons rather than personal ones? Not at all, Alexander replied quickly. I want to have children with you because I love you and because I believe we would be good parents. But the political reality is that our children would also provide stability for the kingdom and remove one of the vulnerabilities that our enemies hope to exploit. Before Catherine could respond, there was a gentle knock at the dining room door. Captain Hartford entered with a formal bow, his expression serious but respectful. Your Highnesses, forgive the interruption, but King Edmund requests Prince Alexander's immediate presence in his private study. He says the matter is urgent and relates to your return from Valdoria. Alexander and Catherine exchanged glances. Word of Alexander's return was supposed to have been kept quiet until he had time to rest and plan his next steps. If King Edmund was requesting an immediate meeting, something had happened to change those plans. Did Father indicate what prompted this urgent meeting? Alexander asked. His Majesty received a diplomatic messenger from Valdoria about an hour ago, Your Highness. The message was marked as requiring immediate royal attention. Catherine felt her heart sink. A message arriving so soon after Alexander's departure from Valdoria could only mean that Prince Ricardo's faction had decided to escalate their campaign of misinformation. Very well, Alexander said, standing immediately. Please inform His Majesty that I will attend him directly. He turned to Catherine. I should handle this alone initially, but depending on what Father has learned, I may need you to join us. Of course, Catherine agreed. I'll wait in our chambers. Send word if you need me. Alexander kissed her forehead gently, a gesture that had always been his way of reassuring her during times of uncertainty. Whatever this message contains, we'll deal with it together. The truth has a way of emerging, even when people try to obscure it with lies. After Alexander left for his father's study, Catherine found herself pacing their private sitting room, unable to concentrate on any activity. She attempted to read, but the words on the page seemed to blur together. She tried working on her embroidery, but her hands were too restless to create the precise stitches the delicate work required. Lady Margaret appeared after about an hour, carrying a tea service and wearing the kind of carefully neutral expression that usually meant she had information to share, but was uncertain whether she should speak freely. "Your Highness, I thought you might enjoy some tea while you wait for Prince Alexander," Margaret said, setting down the elegant porcelain service that had been Catherine's wedding gift from Alexander's grandmother. "Thank you, Margaret. You look like you have something on your mind. What have you heard?" Margaret glanced toward the door, then moved closer to Catherine's chair. "Your Highness, the diplomatic messenger who arrived this afternoon was traveling with unusual urgency. The palace guards mentioned that his horse was nearly exhausted, suggesting he had ridden with great speed. Additionally, he requested to speak only with King Edmund directly, which is unusual protocol for routine diplomatic communications." "Did anyone overhear the content of the message?" Catherine asked, though she knew that proper royal protocol would have prevented such eavesdropping. "Not directly, Your Highness. However, after meeting with the messenger, His Majesty immediately summoned Lord Chancellor Williams and General Morrison to his study. When Prince Alexander arrived, the meeting expanded to include all 4 men. The inclusion of the Lord Chancellor and the kingdom's top military general suggested that whatever news had arrived from Valdoria had serious implications for both diplomatic relationships and potentially military preparedness. Catherine was considering whether to send a message to Alexander asking for an update when the sitting room door opened and Alexander himself appeared, his expression grim but controlled. "How serious is the situation?" Catherine asked immediately, rising from her chair. "Serious enough that Father wants to speak with both of us together," Alexander replied. The message from Valdoria contained accusations that require a coordinated royal response. As they walked together through the palace corridors toward King Edmund's study, Alexander provided Catherine with preliminary details about the message. "As we suspected, Prince Ricardo moved quickly after my departure to present his version of events to King Marcus. The message to Father contains formal accusations that I was engaged in espionage activities while in Valdoria, and it requests that our kingdom provide explanations for my allegedly suspicious behavior." "What specific accusations did Prince Ricardo make?" Catherine asked. "He claims that I was discovered with documents containing detailed information about Valdoria's military defenses and trade secrets. He also alleges that I was asking inappropriate questions about their relationships with other kingdoms and that my sudden departure proves my guilt." Catherine felt anger rising within her at the injustice of the accusations. "Surely King Marcus doesn't believe these claims? He worked with you personally for months." According to the message, King Marcus is requesting our official response to the accusations before making any decisions about future diplomatic relationships. He's being diplomatic, but the implication is clear. If we can't satisfactorily explain my actions, the alliance negotiations are permanently terminated. They reached King Edmund's study, where the guards opened the heavy oak doors immediately upon their approach. Inside, Catherine saw King Edmund seated behind his massive desk, with Lord Chancellor Williams and General Morrison in chairs nearby. All 3 men stood as Catherine and Alexander entered. King Edmund was an imposing figure even in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. Despite his formal bearing, Catherine had always appreciated his genuine warmth toward her and his obvious pride in Alexander's diplomatic abilities. "Catherine, my dear," King Edmund said, moving around his desk to greet her with a paternal embrace. "I'm sorry that Alexander's homecoming has been disrupted by these complications from Valdoria." "Thank you, Your Majesty. Alexander has explained the general situation, but I understand there have been new developments." "Indeed there have," King Edmund replied, gesturing for everyone to be seated. "The accusations from Prince Ricardo are serious enough that they require a formal response from our kingdom. However, the situation is more complex than simple diplomatic disagreement. Lord Chancellor Williams, a scholarly man in his 50s who had served the royal family for over 20 years, opened a leather portfolio containing documents and maps. "Your Highnesses," Lord Chancellor Williams began, Our intelligence network has provided additional information about the situation in Valdoria that confirms Prince Alexander's assessment of Prince Ricardo's motivations. We have evidence that Prince Ricardo has indeed been corresponding with representatives from Blackwood, and that these communications began several weeks before Prince Alexander's mission to Valdoria began. General Morrison, a practical military man who had served with distinction in several border conflicts, spread a map across King Edmund's desk showing the kingdoms surrounding their territory. The strategic implications are significant, General Morrison explained. If Blackwood succeeds in isolating us diplomatically from our traditional allies, they would be in a position to pressure us militarily or economically. Valdoria controls key trade routes, and losing their cooperation would force us to rely more heavily on trade relationships that Blackwood could more easily disrupt. King Edmund leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The question now is how we respond to these accusations in a way that preserves our reputation while also exposing the truth about Prince Ricardo's collaboration with our enemies. Father, Alexander said, I believe we should provide King Marcus with a complete account of what actually happened, including the evidence we have of Prince Ricardo's correspondence with Blackwood. If we can demonstrate that the accusations against me are part of a larger conspiracy, King Marcus may be willing to reconsider his position. That's certainly one option, King Edmund agreed. However, we must also consider the possibility that King Marcus is already too influenced by Prince Ricardo's faction to accept evidence that contradicts their narrative. Catherine had been listening carefully to the discussion, and an idea began forming in her mind. Your Majesty, what if we approached this situation from a different angle? Instead of simply defending against Prince Ricardo's accusations, what if we took the initiative to expose the broader conspiracy involving Blackwood? All four men turned their attention to Catherine, interested in her perspective. Catherine had often contributed valuable insights to policy discussions, and her suggestions were always carefully considered. Please continue, Catherine, King Edmund encouraged. If we have evidence that Prince Ricardo has been working with Blackwood, then presumably we also have information about other activities they might be planning. Rather than responding defensively to Valdoria, we could reach out to other allied kingdoms to warn them about Blackwood's strategy of undermining diplomatic relationships. Lord Chancellor Williams nodded thoughtfully. That approach would position us as providing valuable intelligence rather than simply making excuses for allegedly questionable behavior. It would also put pressure on King Marcus to reconsider his position, General Morrison added. If other kingdoms confirm that they've experienced similar interference from Blackwood, it would support Prince Alexander's account of what happened in Valdoria. King Edmund smiled, the expression transforming his formal features into something warmer and more approachable. Catherine, that's an excellent strategic insight. Alexander, you're fortunate to have married someone who understands both diplomacy and human nature so well. Alexander reached over to squeeze Catherine's hand, his expression showing both pride and affection. I've always known that Catherine sees situations clearly, but her perspective on this crisis is particularly valuable. Very well, King Edmund decided. Lord Chancellor Williams, please prepare communications to our allies warning them about Blackwood's strategy and providing them with the evidence we have about Prince Ricardo's activities. General Morrison, I want our intelligence network to focus on gathering additional information about Blackwood's plans, particularly any other diplomatic interference they might be planning. As the meeting continued with discussions of specific tactical approaches, Catherine found herself thinking about how this crisis, challenging as it was, had ultimately brought her and Alexander closer together and had demonstrated the strength of their partnership in facing difficult situations together.